of Ukraine is Ivo Dalder. He is the former United States ambassador to NATO, and he is the president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, which is marking this month its 100th anniversary. And the ambassador is a global affairs specialist throughout his career, and he was the Director of European Affairs in the National Security Council under President Clinton. And thank you for joining us as the world is in this very consequential moment. I just want to jump to the big news that's happening now, Mr. Ambassador. President Biden is going to be heading to Brussels next week to meet with his NATO counterparts as the fighting and the devastation of Ukraine is getting worse. What can NATO do at this point?
Well, first of all, thanks very much for having me. Great to have the opportunity to talk to you and to your audience. It is a big meeting. It's rare for NATO to have an emergency summit meeting. They already had one virtually a couple of weeks ago, and now it's going to be in person. I think it's very important to have this meeting and to really take stock of where we are. 3 weeks ago, when this war started, unprovoked, unnecessarily, illegally, and unjustified, at that moment, the world changed in a pretty fundamental way. I think we will remember February 24th, really in the same way we remembered the 7/7, Pearl Harbor, or November 9th, when the Berlin Wall came down, or even September 11th, of course, the attacks on New York and Washington and in Pennsylvania, as historical turning points. And in order to make sure that we understand what that historical turning point is all about, it's important that we sit down with our most important allies, which are, of course, our allies in Europe. And he's going there to have a discussion about NATO, about how NATO can strengthen its own posture to make sure that Vladimir Putin understands that whatever is happening in Ukraine, there is a very big barrier for expanding that war to include NATO territory. It also, I think, is going to be an opportunity to have a discussion about how NATO can do more to help Ukraine to defend itself, particularly in providing arms and information. I expect a reaffirmation that NATO is not going to get directly involved in the conflict, and also to start thinking about what ifs. What if Vladimir Putin decides that he is stuck and now needs to do something outrageous, even more outrageous than he's already engaged in, using chemical or biological agents, or God forbid, nuclear weapons, and how NATO should prepare for that. So I think that's a big part of his meeting. He's also, of course, meeting with the leaders of the European Union to reinforce the importance of the sanctions regime. These need to be tightened every day. It is important that as the outrage and atrocities continue, the pain on Putin and the Russian economy is increased. So looking ahead at what kind of sanctions could be implemented, as well as looking at joint diplomatic strategies to isolate Russia on a global way. So it's really a big effort to continue to mobilize at least the transatlantic community, but really, frankly, the entire world community, to stand up against this outrage that we've been unfortunately seeing on our television screens and reading about in our newspapers.
Since the United States and the NATO countries, though, are sending in weapons, they're not doing, a no-fly zone. They're not sending in planes. Why wouldn't Putin just say you're sending in the arms is the pretext he needs to push further?
Well, there is, of course, a big distinction between providing a country with the means to defend itself and directly engaging in conflict on behalf of that country. And the U.S. and NATO, up to this point, has made that distinction very clear. It's one thing to provide weapons, and I think the decisions just over the past couple of days to increase the flow of weapons, in particular the kind of capabilities that are necessary to take on these large armored forces that the Russians have inside Ukraine, is important. But it is a different level of engagement if you were to bring in your own troops. And so,
well, I'm not talking about troops.
No, I understand.
Even what we're doing, why wouldn't Putin just say, "I take that as an attack"?
Well, because he would then what would he do about it? He would have to go to war against NATO and the United States, which he might decide to do in any case. He's already had enough trouble trying to deal with a Ukraine that is a relatively small military compared to his own military. Taking on the U.S. and NATO military at the same time might be something that he is not particularly inclined to do. He may decide to do that in any case. He doesn't need the excuse of the United States or NATO allies providing arms to Ukraine. If he wants to go and take on NATO, he's a neighbor of NATO territory in Norway and of course in the Baltic states. If he wants to do that, he can do it. The problem is that then he will be at war with the United States, whereas now he's only at war with Ukraine, even though the US and NATO are providing armaments.
So China at the moment is a Russian ally. Tomorrow, President Biden is going to talk with China President Xi. Is he a reliable ally to Russia? What is the deliverable that you think the United States wants and President Biden wants in that conversation?
Well, what we would want is President Xi to stand up for the values that China has preached for the past 80 years. The idea of territorial integrity, independence, sovereignty, non-interference in the internal affairs of states. Those are the values that China has propagated for many years, and including up to the day that Russia invaded Ukraine. It is one country that has violated those values, and that's Russia by invading Ukraine without reason or provocation. And as a result, what you would want Xi to do is to stand up and say, we are with the rest of the world community and think what Russia is doing is wrong. And specifically, first of all, not undermine the sanctions that have been implemented on the financial side, and importantly on buying particularly Russian commodities. That's not likely to happen. But secondly, at the very least, not engage in or halt any arms supply that they are providing to the Russians. The White House has indicated that we have information that the Russians have not only requested China to help send weapons, but in fact, the Chinese have been doing so, that they are directly aiding the war effort against Ukraine, and that a failure to stop that will have consequences for the relationship the United States has with China. And I think that's the key question that President Biden will put to President Xi as they meet, talk on the phone tomorrow.
So do you think that China will make that commitment? And do you think, what do we do? What's the leverage we have now to force President Xi to do something? Or is tomorrow not the day to get that answer, just to lay out the...
Well, it looks like that when Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, talked to his counterpart earlier this week, that he didn't get the right answer. And that was why it's now elevated to the top. There's two ways to look at this. From China's perspective, they are at least as surprised, I think, as the Russians were to the Western reaction. China had, and Xi Jinping himself in particular, has for the past few years talked about the decline of the West, the decline of the United States, that the United States is a paper tiger, that is really not capable of offering much resistance, that countries like China that had their own particular ways of doing business, and indeed countries like Russia and China were superior to the democratic ways of democratic countries and the liberalism that we all cherish. And all of a sudden, after the invasion of Ukraine, the entire Western world has stand up as one in a quite remarkable show of unity that is not just the usual friends of the United States, but includes Singapore, a country that generally doesn't engage in sanctioned behavior. Singapore has sanctioned the Russians. It includes, as neutral a country as you possibly can think of, Switzerland, which has imposed banking sanctions. So the Chinese are looking at this and saying, my God, if they can do this for Russia, they can do it against us too. So that's the wake-up call, you would hope. On the other hand, Xi Jinping clearly has thrown his lot in with Vladimir Putin. They've met 39 times in the last 8 years. Wow. They just signed early, just before the Olympics, a 5,300-word joint statement in which they said that their partnership had, quote, no limits. Clearly, Putin, I think, lied to Xi by saying that he wasn't going to do what he did. We warned the Chinese that this is exactly what he was going to do. He believed Putin. He didn't believe us, but he's stuck with him. So far, all indications are that China is going to stay where they are, which is in close alignment with Russia. And the leverage we will have on China is that this kind of behavior has costs, as we are demonstrating when it comes to Russia.
Laura, we can't hear you. Laura, okay, one moment. Okay. Now we still can't hear you. I'm so sorry. Could you?
I'm sorry, Ambassador. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
I'd like to pick up on those costs. You mentioned sanctions earlier, and that next week there'll be more discussion about additional sanctions. And this relates to we like to take questions from the audience, and advanced questions. And so we have a question from Debbie Savage. She asked, why can't NATO help get fighter jets to Ukraine, or Ukrainian pilots, or get Ukrainian pilots to go from Poland? And that just relates to one of the things that's been thrown out there. What, if you could answer that question, but also what are some of the additional sanctions that might be considered that might push this further along?
Well, so on the military aid, one of those issues has indeed been the question of providing airplanes to the Ukrainians. It's a complicated issue. There's sort of two aspects to thinking about this. One is if you want to avoid NATO pilots, fighters being involved in the war, the question is, how do you move airplanes across the border? So one possibility, as the questioner is for Ukrainian pilots to come to Poland and then fly those aircraft from Poland into Ukraine. The second question is a technical one, which is really, are Ukrainian pilots able to fly these airplanes? They have similar airplanes in their own armed forces, but over the last 30 years, the Polish MiG-29s, is the Soviet model airplanes, have been upgraded. The avionics have been upgraded and changed, and so there's a question whether, in fact, the Ukrainians could fly these airplanes. So those are sort of the technical issues, and there's more about whether airplanes really are the most effective way to deal with this with the threat, given that most of the airfields have been bombed by the Russians, and it becomes harder to take off and land. And so the kinds of capabilities that are now being sent, and that President Biden announced yesterday as part of his $1 billion additional dollars of military assistance, are surface-to-air missiles that can hit Russian airplanes flying higher than some of the weapons that we sent before. Of course, anti-armor capabilities, shooting tanks and artillery systems, logistical supply lines, etc., which the Ukrainians have proven to be very effective in. And now we're sending, for the first time, some armed drones. These are interesting drones that can be carried in a backpack by soldiers individually, shot out of a tube, can hover and then be directed at a particular target and explode upon impact. It's those kinds of capabilities, as well as other Soviet or Russian-made equipment, particularly air defense systems that some of our allies in Eastern Europe have, that we are trying to get into Ukrainian hands in order for the Ukrainians to be able to continue to mount the really extraordinary resistance they have done so far in the best possible way. But you need to be trained on these systems. You need to know how they work. You need to know that you don't do damage to yourself, you only do damage to the enemy. And so when you have a citizens militia The most important thing is body armor and helmets and guns and ammunition, which are also being sent in great numbers under this latest aid package.
So that's also part of the $1 billion package. That you
Also part of the $1
earlier.
billion, and that's just what the United States is doing. The Poles are doing things. The Balts are doing. The Europeans have also come up with about $1 billion worth of equipment or $1 billion to purchase equipment that can be then sent to the Ukrainians. So there's a very, very large flow of weapons into Ukraine. And there's no lack of manpower on the Ukrainians. Ukraine has forbidden men between the age of 18 and 60 from leaving Ukraine. Not a lot want to leave anyway. There is a mass mobilization in all kinds of ways, military, humanitarian, and in every way, and artists and lawyers and dentists and folks from all walks of life are engaged in helping this fight in the best possible way.
So one of the things that happened, and it's not clear if President Biden did this by happenstance or calculation, since he called Putin a war criminal. So, Mr. Ambassador, however and whatever the circumstances Biden said it, it was after a signing of the Violence Against Women Act. He said it, and it seems a profound assessment. But what does it really change in the short term, and what does it mean in the long term?
Secretary of State Blinken repeated the assessment today. So if it was accidental, it's definitely now the official line. I don't think it was accidental. And the reality is it won't change many things in the beginning, in the immediate term. It does put Putin on notice that someone will be held accountable for what are crimes of war. These are war crimes that are being committed. The WHO, the World Health Organization, has just announced that 47 hospitals have been bombed. That's 47 war crimes individually. Those hospitals are full with people who need water, electricity, and medical care that is now denied to them. We saw this horrific pictures of the maternity hospital being bombed in Mariupol. We've seen the most horrendous pictures. This is not war where military is fighting against military to take territory. This is a siege, sort of a Middle East or a Middle Age siege mentality in which a city is deprived of food, water, electricity, in which humanitarian corridors are being bombed so that people cannot and will not flee, in which shelters are being bombed deliberately, as happened again in Mariupol with the bombing of the theater, where everyone knew women and children were being left. And so calling a spade, calling Vladimir Putin a war criminal is just a fact on the ground. I think the U.S. has also made the assessment, frankly, that and the intelligence community testified to this on Capitol Hill last week. Bill Burns, the CIA director, and Avril Haines, the director of national intelligence, that Putin is going to double down. That he is not he's not looking for a way out. He's not looking for off ramps. He's not looking for a diplomatic solution that allows him to escape back to a way before. He believes that this war is fundamental to the future, if not of Russia, at least of his own. And so that's what we're seeing.
So if taking a diplomatic resolution to this is off the table, then is it only a matter of is it sanctions? Are there two options? Is Route 1 sanctions work, or somehow there's a military victory? And if there is, by the way, how would we define victory? Just Russia stopping where they are, or pushing the Russian forces back to the Russian border?
So I think Vladimir Putin is not going to settle for anything less than ensuring that Moscow has control over Ukraine, or at least large swaths of Ukraine, including a new government. I mean, he's made that very clear. That's what he's about. He's not going to change. His psychology doesn't allow for somebody to say, I made the mistake, I'm going back. So how does this end? One way it might end is through just a stalemate, a military stalemate, in which he doesn't achieve what he wants to achieve, and we will have a long war of attrition that at some point just people are exhausted, and it ends that way. By the way, that war is still going on in Syria, just so it's not like you need a diplomatic end. It's been going on in Syria now for 11 years. And in other places too, and it could in this part of the world as well. The second, I think, more likely possibility is that the pain that is being inflicted on Russian forces inside Ukraine, on the Russian economy through the sanctions regime that has been established over time, will lead to internal questioning inside Russia about the wisdom of this course, whether that internal questioning comes from the security services and some of the leaders around Vladimir Putin and lead them to take matters in their own hand, or it comes from the street where large-scale demonstrations might emerge, not next week, not next month perhaps, but down the road as the sanctions really bite, and the security forces, who of course are going to be suffering under the same sanctions, deciding that they're not going to shoot their people. By the way, this is what happened in 1991 when there were a significant uprising against Boris Yeltsin, and there was a refusal by the Russian security forces then to shoot at the people. As you remember, there was the tank shooting at the Russian White House in support of the People's Revolution. So that's how this may well end, rather than a negotiation between Vladimir Putin and President Zelensky.
Well, another possibility, which has been discussed, is that Putin may feel at some point, if he's not winning, back into a corner. And you said earlier that there's a possibility that he might attack NATO or attack a country that's a possibility of use of nuclear weapons. What do you think might trigger that option? Do you think that's a real possibility with Putin? And what might trigger that? What might push him over that edge?
I think it is a real possibility that he feels he can't afford to stalemate. He's stuck and he needs to find a way out. And the way out is to escalate rather than de-escalate. I mean, all the pressure that people see leading to a diplomatic solution is the same pressure that can lead to him to escalate and try to change the nature of the game, shock the world in a way that he can then achieve through pressure that presumably we would put on the Ukrainians to settle. I think the more likely response, and by the way, the response that I would hope we would start not only thinking about, but advertising, is no, actually, you do that, we're going to get involved. And we're going to help the Ukrainians beat you in Ukraine. Directly and materially, in order to, you have then changed the game so much that in a phrase that President Obama used in not dissimilar circumstances, it would change our calculation. Right now, our calculation is we're not prepared to send our troops into Ukraine to defend Ukraine, or NATO to do that. When you use chemical or biological agents and kill hundreds, if not thousands of people that way, as we saw in Syria, if you use a nuclear weapon for the first time since 1945, first time since the World War II that any country would have used a nuclear weapon in war or in peace, that changes things. And I would at that moment would expect and certainly favor us coming to the aid of Ukraine and making sure that Russia is defeated in Ukraine. Not about Russia. Russia can go back and exist. We don't have to change the borders there, but to at least go back to a situation in which Ukraine is in full control of its own territory.
But to clarify, does that mean that there is something the U.S. could go alone then if the U.S. chose to, and not make it a NATO?
Well, I think you would need to do this as part of NATO, or at least as part of the countries there, because you need the territory and the airspace from which to deploy troops into Ukraine. In theory, you could do it without that, but in practice, it'd be hard to do that without Poland and Hungary and other countries being part of it. And by the way, I think it should be a NATO operation, or at least a NATO decision. NATO is capable of doing that. It has in the past decided to use military force without being itself attacked. Under Article 51 of the UN Charter, Ukraine has a right not only of self-defense, but of collective self-defense. If the Ukrainians ask us for help and we provide it, we are perfectly legal, able to do so legally. And when chemical and biological or nuclear weapons are used, the outrage, presumably, of the world will allow us to have a large enough coalition, NATO-led, I hope, to get engaged in there.
And that's what President Zelensky is pleading for. So he addressed the Canadian Parliament, he addressed the US Congress, he addressed the German Parliament. Now, I want to know what you think of his invoking the Holocaust today and what it could mean for the Germans when, in case our listeners haven't heard, Zelensky invoked the phrase "never again" when he was talking to Germany, which is Elie Wiesel's famous phrase about the Holocaust. Saying that to the Germans was what? What was it supposed to do in invoking that phrase? And what do you think the Germans will do? What do you think?
I think he has played an extraordinarily adroit, very weak hand with European allies. It was his call for more sanctions to the European Union that led Germany and other countries to adopt the SWIFT, the sanctions, the banking sanctions on Russians being kicked out of the SWIFT mechanism. It was his call and the use of Churchillian language to the English, to the Parliament in the UK. He talked about, we will fight in the fields, we will fight in our neighborhoods, in our cities, on the beaches, we will never surrender. A very famous Winston Churchill speech at the beginning of World War II. I think he very adroitly used the image of Pearl Harbor, of 9/11 when he spoke to Congress yesterday. And I think the image of never again is meant to mobilize support, and it's very effective. It's not a coincidence that President Biden announced the $800 million in assistance yesterday in the immediate aftermath of Zelensky speaking to Congress. And so what he's doing is he's using history. He's trying to put people in Ukrainian shoes today by reminding people what they were like in their shoes in their own history, as a means to mobilize support. And he has emerged in the last 3 weeks as a remarkable leader of his people, but also in many ways putting the international community to a test, if not to shame, in order to say this is not our fight. This is not just our fight. This is your fight too, and you need to be part of it. And I think it's very, very effective. And so that's where I think this is coming from. For what's happening is not the Holocaust, but boy, I was born and raised in the Netherlands, and the bombing of Rotterdam in 1940, which lasted for 5 days and destroyed half the city, sure looks a lot like what we're seeing in Mariupol right now, or the bombing of Aleppo, of course, by the Russians and the Syrians, and by the Russians in Grozny in Chechnya. Sure looks like that. So using these images as a means to mobilize is very effective, and it's not only effective, it's true.
Have you met Zelensky, by the way?
I've not. I've met his predecessor and many of his aides, and he, as you all know, he was a comedian, played a president on TV, and then, of course, was overwhelmingly elected. He had 70% of the vote. Was a bit of a disappointment, I think, to pay people, because he was elected on an anti-corruption platform, wasn't quite able to deliver as much as people had hoped. But he sure is coming out now and showing what true leadership looks like.
And with that, thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Ambassador. We talk about some things that we think are important, and then we come to this moment in time where we really are at a crossroads, maybe a World War III, maybe we're in it already and we just haven't called it that. In any event, we appreciate you joining us and everything you've said, and Thanks so much. And again, happy anniversary to the Chicago Council on Global Affairs.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here, and it was a special anniversary, but we're continuing to celebrate. So, thanks.
Okay.
To another 100 years.
Right.
Hopefully, with less war and less destruction.
Yeah,
but
absolutely. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Take it away.
Thank you, Lynn. And now we're going to move to more local Illinois and Chicago politics with a stellar panel of people that you know, that you've seen before in our bylines and on this show. John Seidel, who's the Sun-Times federal courts reporter, is with us. Dan Mahopoulos, a former Chicago Sun-Times reporter who now covers government and politics for WBEZ, Chicago Public Radio, and Rachel Hinton, who's been quite a regular with us. Welcome back, Rachel. She's now the enterprise reporter at the Better Government Association, but also a former Chicago Sun-Times reporter. Welcome to all of you. Lots to talk about. I want to pick up with you, John, because you covered the federal courts. You've been covering the Mike Madigan saga, the Ed Burke saga, which it's looking like it's going to continue for some time, maybe some years to come. But give us the latest update on where we are with the federal. There's been a federal indictment of both those people, and where are we now in terms of the ongoing investigations?
Sure. Well, yeah, we had some pretty significant developments. You mentioned them. A couple of weeks ago, we finally saw the long anticipated federal racketeering indictment of former Speaker of the House, Michael Madigan, as well as a longtime confidant of his, Michael McLean. They're charged in several schemes. I think there's been lots of reporting about the scandal at ComEd. You know, ComEd had been charged with bribery some years ago. We saw McLean charged in another indictment with the ComEd. But it's not just limited to ComEd. It actually, there's quite a bit about the work of former Alderman Danny Solis in the indictment. Multiple schemes involving him. And it's one of the most significant public corruption cases we've seen in Illinois in quite some time. And you're right, it's related to the Burke case. The Burke case is coming up on, well, his indictment was a little bit less than 3 years ago. We're coming up on the 3-year anniversary of that. No trial date set for him yet. And pretty much everyone that I talked to about the Mike Madigan case is anticipating that will also play on for years. So we've just kind of reached a new chapter in this saga that, as you mentioned, has gone on for quite some time.
And so now there's been an indictment, Madigan's been arraigned. Are we likely to see any more shoes drop in terms of new indictments, in terms of new revelations on this case coming up in the near future?
I think that's probably a safe bet. And you're
probably
right.
working on something right now, right?
Probably. Well, so yeah, you're right. I should note that Speaker Madigan and Mr. McLean, they were arraigned. They did plead not guilty, and both men have claimed innocence for quite some time now. But yeah, I think there have been multiple reports pointing out ways in which this case might expand. And U.S. Attorney John Lausch at his press conference announcing the indictment, I think, acknowledged that this is an ongoing investigation. So yeah, I think there is a good chance that this is not the end of it and that we will see more. And maybe even this indictment of Michael Madigan expands.
So
Dan, you were nodding your head there a minute ago. You've been covering the story as well. What are you looking for? What's coming up next from your perspective?
There's certainly possibly a superseding indictment. I mean, John could speak more to the actual process in terms of the courts, but I do know that there are other companies. They mentioned in the indictment very pointedly that there were various companies that Madigan abused his power with, so to speak. And we've only seen one company, though, really in the indictment, namely ComEd. We do know that another company disclosed to the SEC that they could be charged. And so there are other ones that have been mentioned in subpoenas, for instance, that were delivered to Madigan and to other entities a while back in the summer of 2020, when ComEd made that admission that they had bribed the longtime Speaker of the House, who was not named at that time, but who we all knew who it was. So these are fluid things. These are dynamic situations. And surely they're trying to squeeze some of the other people, hoping that somebody will flip, hoping that somebody will turn government witness, will be a cooperator. People down in Madigan's ward might call that kind of person a rat, but the nomenclature here locally. So I think it's very possible
I
that
thought the
there
term
could be
was
other
snitch,
situations.
Dan.
I'm
Dan, I
sorry.
thought the term was snitch, not a rat. When
Well, it's synonymous in the 13th ward and many other wards of Chicago.
or a flipper.
Flipper too.
And so
Flipper too.
people know,
Somebody
flipper,
like Scott Faywell in the George Ryan case, when that ex-governor
a
was tried.
flipper might have started as a snitch, but then they realize they're in trouble and they become a flipper. Anyway, please go on. Don't let me.
It's pretty much all the same thing. It's an issue of whether you're going to admit some kind of guilt and cooperate with the government and do what you can, or you're going to continue to fight. And for instance, Mike McLean being so close to Mike Madigan. There's so few people that were so close to Mike Madigan as Mike McLean was. I think having recorded so many of his conversations, the feds would love for him to admit his guilt, but he says he's not guilty. He says he would never cooperate. He told us in an interview before he was even indicted himself that he's been asked to cooperate. So these are fluid situations. There's a huge amount of pressure. I don't want to be, no pun intended, flippant about it, because this is these older guys here who are facing maybe losing what time they have left on this planet with their families, and their freedom could be lost. But Mike McLean, I think it's ironic that today's St. Patrick's Day. Mike McLean and Mike Madigan, two Irish politicos whose Guinness might be tasting especially bitter today.
Right. So, and I know, Rachel, we'll get you in a minute. I want to make a quick point for everyone. The other big difference between a Madigan and a Burke and a McLean and others that are in trouble is Madigan can use his political fund, of which he has millions, that he has access to for his legal defense. McLean, a mere human, would have to pay out of his own pocket his defense. And I think that makes a difference. We've all covered people who say they pled because they just couldn't afford the hundreds of thousands of dollars to have even go to trial. But anyway, my question for Rachel is, we have a June 28 midterm coming. Republicans are already talking about Madigan and corruption. What race will this have the most impact on right now?
I believe we could see this have a big impact on the governor's race. Governor Pritzker was named or alluded to in the indictment. He is not charged with any wrongdoing. The U.S. attorney last week tried to make that very clear that, the Pritzker is not involved in this. He did nothing wrong. In fact, Pritzker, I believe the next day talked about talking to the feds for, I believe, an hour or more to give them information, just to basically clear his name, to make clear that he had no agenda here. But I think we're already seeing Republicans really try to tie Madigan once again to Pritzker, as well as, any candidate I'm sure that Pritzker wants to support. We could see a tie to Madigan and the Madigan enterprise during the primary election, and probably once again in November. This will probably complicate a few state house races, as well as a few state Senate races. We could maybe see this come up, I believe, in the Senate race, Tammy Duckworth, but she's fairly safe. So I don't know that we'll see that come up.
But what was interesting is Kathy Selby, who was the best known Republican running, and she just jumped in the race Monday. She brought up the Pritzker Madigan thing as an issue in her primary without really mentioning any federal issues. But to everybody, what do you assess is the ripple effect? Can it hurt Democrats? Now we know that it's out there. Rachel set it up. Can we just go around the room here, Laura and John, and if you reporter, you might not. Just what is the impact? Can it work?
Well, I'll be interested to. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Rachel.
I'll be interested to see how well it works this time around. Last election. We saw Republicans do this very successfully with the proposed move to a graduated income tax. They unseated a sitting Illinois Supreme Court justice. They really just harangued Governor Pritzker and many of his ballot measures, many candidates. So I believe that Democrats have already in many ways had to deal with this. They've had a reckoning with Madigan being named or alluded to in ComEd's deferred prosecution agreement. So I'll be curious to see how this affects the midterms, other than, lip service to Madigan being the head of this party for so long.
It's different now because now he's indicted. If they were able to make some headway when he wasn't indicted. Anyway,
that's why I think we'll still see this come up, but it'll be interesting to me to see how effective that is this time around.
Well, that'll be the key test. I mean, he's indicted, but he's no longer in office. He's no longer in power. And thanks in some ways to some of his own colleagues who finally, the famous 19 legislators who finally turned on him and helped push him out of office. So he's a different animal in terms of how the Republicans can no longer say he's pulling the strings. They can say he did, but that influence is gone. But John, I wanted to come back to you on the whole issue of corruption, and the question that most voters keep asking is, why do you end up in federal court over and over again for, all of us for decades, covering these very powerful politicians who always seem to forget about the legal lines and step over the lines? Why is the message not getting through to elected officials that corruption is going to knock them off?
It's interesting that you asked this question today. I just came from the sentencing of former Alderman Ricardo Munoz, where this was really a key question. We see this from time to time. These defense attorneys for politicians saying, clearly there's no deterrent effect on public corruption, because look at how many politicians we've sent to prison just to have it happen over and over again. And that was part of the conversation during Alderman Munoz's sentencing today. It's hard. I think about that myself, why this keeps happening. Is it a really aggressive U.S. Attorney's Office? I think there's something to be said about that, but this did not start with John Lausch or Zach Farden or Pat Fitzgerald. I mean, the history of corruption in this state goes back forever, and so you have to say that it's part of the culture as well. And just again, to circle back, I'm thinking again about the defense attorney for Ricardo Munoz, Richard Kling, who I think just had kind of summed it up as, they just don't think they're going to get caught, and even if they do get caught, maybe it's the cost is worth it, the risk is worth it. I don't know. Those are some concepts that we've heard, and we just had that conversation today, so it's definitely topical.
Yes, Rick Munoz was in the city council for a long time and saw several of his colleagues go down while he was there, but clearly that wasn't enough of a warning sign for him. Did not stop him, no, from taking money from the Reform Caucus.
And what was the sentence?
13 months.
Oh, so that
he was convicted of.
I'm sorry.
He pleaded guilty to wire fraud and money laundering. He admitted that he took about $38,000 from the Chicago Progressive Reform Caucus. His attorney argued that his corruption was in a different category than, he kept referring to somebody who would buy a Senate seat or sell a Senate seat. And I think the judge acknowledged that and said it's not quite a quid pro quo case. One more point real quick. There was a lot of discussion about comments made by Judge Gary Feinerman years ago when former Cook County Commissioner Joseph Mario Moreno was sentenced. Judge Feinerman made the comment that you've got to change the cost benefit analysis. And I believe in that sentencing, he actually gave Moreno 11 years. So he was arguing, boost the penalty, make it change the cost benefit analysis. I'm not sure that happened in Munoz's sentencing today, but that's been taled about.
Well, Rob Blagojevich got a pretty stiff sentence when he went to prison, former Governor Rob Blagojevich, and it didn't seem to change his tune. He's still out there professing his innocence.
Here we are,
Lynn?
10 years later. Yeah.
Right. So, and by the way, it's interesting because Blagojevich actually they never established that he took anything. But I want to move on to the governor's race, and Rachel and Dan have been covering it. So let's focus on this Republican primary, where it's, Rachel, we've had talk of it. Could you just do the horse race stand for us? Who stands where? The petitions closed Monday. Seems like one candidate Sullivan, may have a petition challenge on it. Could you just kind of quickly tell us the starting point of the Republican primary now, and how do you establish who's ahead, who's behind, just in what you see now in your analysis?
Yeah, difficult to handicap, but basically boils down to another situation of an inter-party fight in the GOP between people who are conservative and people who are way far to the right. There's even a whole other slate now of people that believe in the lie of election fraud. But the major candidates that seem to be shaping up here, at least the ones who have the backing of the big donors, Richard Irvin, the Aurora mayor, who has the backing of the richest man in the state, Ken Griffin, who, by the way, is teaming up now at the same time with the owners of the Cubs to try to buy Chelsea. And somebody told me today, a source told to me, well, what does he want to buy a lousy soccer team for? This is a huge.
That's the soccer team in the UK. So
it's a huge club in London, European champions. He's got a lot of money. That's my point.
For sale, it goes to our first segment because the owner is a Russian oligarch,
Roman Abramovich, right?
Who wanted to give up. But let's back on point, please.
Well, the point being that this guy's got a lot of money and he's backing Richard Irvin, who's practically unknown on a state level, black man from Aurora, not the typical profile of your Republican voter, but apparently they think that they can do a sort of thing where they make inroads in the large African-American electorate, which is, you know, in many elections, 99% Democratic. On the other hand, you have
a Republican primary. In order for this thought to work, you would have to figure out who your Republican primary vote is.
Well, it seems that his main challenger, main opponent, I should say, because there's obviously no Republican incumbent here, the main opponent here is possibly Darren Bailey. He has the backing of the Uline family. We're from Lake Forest, but moved their business just across the state line to Pleasant Prairie, Wisconsin. That's the Uline company that practically anything that you get in a box comes in their product. So again, I'm not trying to deviate here and talk about soccer or boxes, but I'm saying big money is being potentially put into these races, or at least they have that option if they think that they have a chance to win that nomination and really challenge J.B. Pritzker. But to go back to the earlier question, can they use the corruption in the Democratic Party to beat up on J.B. Pritzker? Absolutely, they're going to try that, and it could work. I mean, this, as unique as Illinois is, it's not operating in a vacuum. This, after all, Lynn knows better than all of us here, is a midterm election that, you know, by many polls is trending nationally more in favor of the Republicans. But, you know, there's a lot of inflation, high gas prices, particularly, not to mention, as I think you mentioned earlier with the ambassador, the verge of and the potential of World War III starting again from Eastern Europe. So, you know, a lot of things can happen here, but that's the general gist of the race in the Republican side. Really conservative guys versus, you know, really conservative guys.
So who
I would say,
Rachel, I hold your thought because I want to go to you. Could you incorporate in it? I mean, I'm willing to say if the others aren't, because I can operate as a columnist. Darren Bailey is part of the Trump wing of the Illinois Republican Party. He's trying to get Trump's endorsement. He's allied with Mary Miller, a representative who has been endorsed by Trump. Rachel, say whatever you were going to say, and then could you address what you think might be the strength of the Trump wing of the Illinois Republican Party?
I was going to say, going off of Dan's point about the Democratic voters, that I believe Irvin and Griffin and those who back him, as well as the slate that Griffin has put together, their goal is to try to pick off those moderate Democrats who may have voted Republican once before, who may be, tired of crime, inflation, the issues of the day, and who may be willing to give someone else a chance. That person might be a Republican. Looking at, Mayor Irvin, he has said a lot of Democratic things in the past, and now is trying to reshape his messaging, his past messaging, to try to appeal to conservatives while also seemingly not trying to completely castigate the people who voted him into office in Aurora. I think with the Trump wing of things, there are a few other people who weren't talked about. We have Darren Bailey, who is the most, I would say, far right of that group. We also have Gary Rabine. And then we have Paul Schimpf, who was a former state senator. I would say, and in that order, most Republican or most Trumpy, second most Trumpy, and then third most Trumpy. I believe with Darren Bailey, the Trump wing of things, the Trump Republicans are still vocal, they're still active. I believe that Donald Trump still has a very large base and a lot of supporters. And so getting his endorsement, getting the nod of someone who was close to Trump could be key for Darren Bailey to secure Republican voters, especially those who may have voted for Trump, who may be worried about the direction that the state is going in, and who may want change, but may not be interested in the sort of change, quote unquote, that Mayor Irvin is talking about or trying to push.
So Rachel, another piece of this is the sort of, you sort of talked about the various grades of rightness in the Republican Party in Illinois. There's also a geography there in terms of where the voters are located, and looking at Richard Irvin, for example, what's his political geography, and what is going to happen when his record really starts to become more clear to the public, because there are plenty of people who don't want to see him, his opponents don't want to see him win the primary. And so what kinds of things are they going to be putting out there, and how effective will that be, the opposition research, so to speak?
Well, we've already seen some reports on his time as a defense attorney representing people who have, been accused of kidnapping people, who've been accused of domestic violence, and other sorts of things. So we've seen that. We've seen his opponents attack him for being a Cook County adjacent Democrat, someone who only really cares about the northern part of the state. Darren Bailey, notably, is from the southern part of the state. He's from Xenia. So I think we're really going to continue to see that division. We're going to continue to see people try to paint Irvin as someone who only cares about, northern Illinois, Chicago, and the collar counties, who doesn't understand what's going on throughout the rest of the state, who's completely out of touch from what regular, everyday Republicans really want. And I think that in some ways that kind of serves Darren Bailey the most, because he's a farmer from downstate, although we don't have enough time to get into the nuances of all that. But he's from downstate Illinois, he's born and raised there. He really, tries to rep these Republican values. And so I think as, this campaign cycle goes on, we're going to continue to see the Republicans in the field, the other Republicans in the field, try to paint Irvin as just not the right choice for the state, not someone who really understands Republican values, who can take the state in the direction that Republicans want to see it go in.
When you say Republican values, this is a distinction that I think is important to point out. We're not talking about conservative fiscal policies or where you stand on the issue of abortion, or if Pritzker spends too much or too little. I think we're talking about, are you a conspiracy? Do you embrace conspiracies? Do you think that you continue to want to litigate the 2020 election? That's what candidates out there who are running as Republicans are. So I want to put out there, and I wonder what you all think. I think we have to label things and talk about things very differently in this 2022 midterm, because it is there is a difference in distinctions that need to be made, because you have people running who want to embrace the full Trump. Conspiracy theories, election denial, etc. Can we take a spin around the panel? I'm curious what everyone thinks and what you think of my analysis here, if we have to talk about this in a different way.
One more thing, and then I'll shut up for a little while. I think that this isn't the Republican Party of the 80s. There is no Reagan. There is no It's Morning in America commercial. We're seeing the people who are now in this party, they want people to vote for them. And so that means embracing some of the things that those voters want. And for reasons that I don't think have time to get into, people are vocally, yelling about these conspiracy theories, yelling that the election was stolen. And so I think that, the Republicans and vying for that vote may feel like they're doing a disservice to not touch on that, and also may actually believe it. I hope that there will be, we can all agree on the facts at some point. But I don't think that right now the Republican Party is one that is going to tell people, no, you're wrong, the election was not wholly stolen. I don't think that we're going to see that writ large. I don't think we even got that in Congress. I think they ended up saying that, this is a very, January 6th was a reasonable political expression. So if we can't,
it was
some people. I'm not saying everybody in the Republican Party is like that, but I am saying that there is a small vocal minority that is really changing the way that the party looks, and they need to pay attention to that part.
And don't forget about the whole issue, and then let's go to John and Dan. The whole issue of COVID and how the governor and how governors are handling COVID, and the whole issue of rights and freedom, and that's something that Darren Bailey really built his claim to fame on, and I think that's another sort of a twin issue, along with the issues that you mentioned that are going to really be in play going forward. Ron DeSantis in Florida has been brilliant at using sort of being the enemy of people who believe in COVID, and he's on his way probably to a presidential campaign because of it. John, what's your take?
Sure. Look, I mean, I have to largely defer to you guys who spend a little bit more time in the political world than the legal world, but yeah.
John, you've spent a lot of time with January 6th defendants from Illinois.
That's true. Yeah, January 6th has been part of my work too. Look, I think Rachel kind of spoke to it. I think the world has changed, and so Lynn, I think you're right. I think we do have to look at things in a different way. I think we have to call things as they are. Rachel mentioned that she doesn't, who knows if we'll agree on the facts. Unfortunately, I'm not sure that we're going to agree on the facts this year or next, but I hope that we can continue to work toward that. And just one other, I guess, random thought circling back to our original conversation, given all these things, given Trump, given January 6th, given the COVID responses, when we ask about, will Madigan affect this? I mean, who knows? There's going to be one factor in all of these things that are swirling around in our elections. So who knows if we'll be able to get a read on that when this is all said and done. But yeah, definitely things are different now.
Dan, we'll give you as we wrap up, we'll give you the final word on what this all means.
My experience with the sort of far right in Illinois and in these campaigns, I did a profile of Darren Bailey when he was starting to come to prominence, getting himself on Fox News for, as you mentioned, Laura, his involvement in the anti-mitigation efforts, legal efforts, and political efforts in that vein. Has a farm that's about the size of Schaumburg, and it's hundreds of miles from here. It's probably as close to Memphis as it is to Chicago. So they're coming from a very different world, but he's a free market guy, but took tons of PPP money, federal pandemic aid money. I think that'll be another issue for him that brings Republicans sort of back to looking at what their values are in terms of government spending. And then also had gone down to Effingham last summer when we haven't talked about Congresswoman Mary Miller, the first term Congresswoman who cited Hitler shortly before she was sworn into her first term, and shortly before, I think, January 6th, if I remember correctly, went to an event that was headlined for Mary Miller by Marjorie Taylor Greene in her first visit to Illinois. That was in Effingham last summer.
Yeah.
A lot of rhetoric that was very, very vitriolic toward Chicago. I mean, I remember one of the lines was, if people come and try to riot here, which is like, where, at your cattle farm? But if people try to riot here, we have guns and we'll shoot back. So how do you really build this campaign to be elected the governor of the entire state? If you're someone, and Darren Bailey, by the way, wasn't at that MTG Mary Miller thing, I should add, but how do you build a campaign when so much of your career is built on hating the Chicago area and Chicago in particular, and painting it as some sort of hellhole that is corrupting the rest of the state? Some of them are even talking about seceding from the rest of Illinois. I believe that Bailey was a co-sponsor of some of that legislation, which of course went nowhere. Having said all that, how do you appeal now to Chicago and turn around? Well, he tried to get a supporter in Logan Square. It turned out to be a January 6th defendant. So there's a lot of contradictions there.
Well, Laura, are we done? Should I wrap it up?
I think we didn't even get to the congressional races. So
okay, we have so much. We're going to have to, and get into all these politics, Laura. I hope everybody knows that we try to get as much in as we can, and if it were left to us, we'd go on another 2 hours. But we're going to wrap it up now. So before I do the commercial for you all to buy Sun Times, I wanted to say our next show is April 21st. And Laura and I are really looking forward to it because we're going to have a segment marking the 100th anniversary of the birth of Mayor Harold Washington. Laura and I were both very involved in being, we were there during his campaigns. And
We're old enough.
we have a different, we covered it from different aspects or involved in different aspects. So we already have that booked for April. But before we go in our final goodbye, listen just for a moment on the need for all of you who have not been subscribing to our Sun-Times e-paper and digital projects. We have a special offer from you. You can get our digital daily replica of the print product. As you know, it lives at paper.suntimes.com. Our offer is for every story, you get everything, only $2.49 a month. suntimes.com/subscribe. As you know, we value our journalism. We value everyone for listening to us, but our bread and butter still is to provide you with as much content as we can over at suntimes.com and our print paper. So please, please buy a subscription. And until then, thanks to Ambassador Dalder for joining us in our first segment, and to John and Dan and Rachel. Thanks so much. See you next month.